So this is the last of the screencasts for week 11. Here we're talking about issues related to migration. Also talk a little bit about migration from Mexico. And then the topic of remittances, which is when migrants send money back home. All right. Migration from Mexico is, all of this information about other migration doesn't mean that we don't have migration from Mexico. To say so would be ludicrous. We're all familiar on some level with migrants from Mexico, but I'd like to stress again that not all migrants from Mexico are illegal, and not all illegal immigrants are Mexican. I know 2 Europeans who were illegal for a time when they stayed here beyond the length of their visas. And we know that about 500,000 Mexicans immigrate or migrate to the U.S. every year, and that about 1 in 100 of them gets a visa and stays legally. So that's about 5,000 or so per year. However, 5% of the entire U.S. workforce is made up of illegal workers, some of which, of course, are Mexicans. So, put that in context. If we have, let's say, about 150 million people working here in the United States as part of the workforce, and 5% of those are illegal, that's at least 7.5 million people who are illegal workers, right? So, the fact that there are 500,000 Mexicans who work here migrate to the U.S. every year, and some of them might be illegal. We can't probably even say that the majority of illegal workers in the U.S. are Mexican. All right, not to belabor the point, but it's a lot of people that are working illegally, but not all of them are from Mexico. Most Mexican migrants, though, are male, and they are agricultural laborers, and they do about 25% return home every year. Fact. There are a lot of opinions about this, but the U.S. needs this labor for the most part. If anybody who's taken this class has worked for less than minimum wage in a non-restaurant job, you know what I'm talking about. I've worked a job like that, $4.25 an hour for agricultural labor, and it's not a very pleasant job. Most people don't want it. And, some people say that illegal workers are taking our jobs, but it's a half-truth. Yes, it happens sometimes, but the majority of jobs lost over the last 15 years have been due to free trade agreements permitting production to take place in Mexico and not be taxed, right? That's the real taking my jobs. It's less to do with the fact that the job that you want to do here now is held by an illegal immigrant, right? That's not to say that it hasn't changed the economy, but the connection is conflicting in many cases. There's still plenty of illegal immigration issues. It's complex. Illegal immigration and migration is definitely a security issue, but restricting border crossing leads to permanent settlement instead of migration. So once you get here, you're less tempted to go home because it's going to be tough to get back. So you stay, right? Illegal workers, yeah, they're taking my job, but free trade includes free labor, and illegals often do work, but they often do the work that Americans don't care to. Finally, our U.S. Agricultural and construction economies actually need illegal labor to be competitive. Yes, illegal workers drain our public services, like it costs money to put their kids in school, and they're not paying taxes sometimes. But actually, many illegals actually pay taxes, definitely at least sales tax, and they even fight in our armed services. So there are up to 17,000 people in the Army, Navy, and Marines that are not U.S. citizens. And these armed forces often keeps these non-citizen soldiers because they have an incentive to perform well, because when they're discharged, they're often granted citizenship. So think about this. Would you serve in the armed forces of a country you are not a citizen in? Probably not, because you would lose your U.S. citizenship. But think about that. You're not a citizen, but you're fighting in the Army or the armed services for that country, with the promise of potentially getting citizenship. To put this sort of into context, during the Iraq War, we had a number of folks from Central America fighting as in the U.S. Army, they would be killed, unfortunately, in, say, roadside bombings or other attacks, and be granted citizenship in death, right? But their families wouldn't be. So, in many cases, this is a tough issue. Legal immigration is very difficult. Related to this, too, is that remittances are a big part of immigration. So remittances, they're money sent home by migrants. If we take Guatemala as an example, in 2006, 3.6 billion US dollars, or over 10% of Guatemala's GNP, were sent from the United States to Guatemala. And that comes out to about $310 per migrant per month. It's crazy. Remittances far exceed the amount of money sent to these countries in international aid. If we look at the case of Ecuador alone, in 2006 it received almost 3 billion US dollars. Mexico, 23 billion US dollars. Brazil, $7.3 billion and growing. Brazil's the second largest group of illegal immigrants to the U.S. Remittances to Latin America and the Caribbean below the amount of international aid that reaches the region out of the water. And this is money sent by private individuals in most cases. So it's a huge part of the economy. If we look at this map in your book, it shows some interesting trends. Basically, this map is the percentage of immigrants from each state who sent remittances. It comes from Chapter 18. But it's interesting, immigrant destinations and their level of remittances are somewhat focused here on the East Coast, right, and the Midwest, but not northern New England, right, the Dakotas, or Wyoming. And why? Well, on the East Coast, it's production work and construction, and agricultural work on the West Coast and the Midwest. But in these places, the jobs are harder to get and maintain for illegal and legal immigrants, actually. Some money comes to Latin America from U.S. states, a lot of it, the majority of it, in fact, including Indiana, which is in the middle of this range. But not all of it comes from the U.S. In fact, you can look at money coming in euros coming from parts of Spain as well. A lot of it comes from the U.S. And if we look at top source states, it comes from New York, Illinois. What's there? Well, agriculture and the city of Chicago, too. California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, and Florida, they're sort of self-explanatory. They have large Hispanic populations, significant links to Latin America. Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia are all places where, up to quite recently, housing markets were booming. So there's a lot of demand for migrant workers in construction trades. Remittances don't just come, like I said, from the U.S. They come from Spain, equivalent in the mid-2000s of about 4.7 billion U.S. dollars coming from Spain to Latin America.